I got an email from a very prominent leading climate scientist. This was one of the things that's kind of one of those career defining moments. He said, you do really good research. I agree with it. It's accurate related to societal effects of extreme weather, but you have to be careful going into a political setting that your research might be misused by the people who are opposed to climate action. And so maybe you should downplay or not even share your conclusions and emphasize the importance of mitigating greenhouse gases. And for me, I got the sense that I was being asked to misrepresent my research for political purposes. And I decided not to do that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, I often say if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. There are hundreds of thousands, literally millions of peer-reviewed papers published on aspects of climate every year. And so I often just simply point to the IPCC as the best available snapshot of where the science is.
I don't think there's anything wrong with having conservatives doing climate science. I would actually prefer to have a world where science was more politically diverse, because I think that would help us not to get into the situation where you've got this incredible partisanship now and culture wars in science. Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm here with Roger Pielke Jr., an old friend of mine who's published papers on climate change for 2 decades, 3 decades, Roger?
3 decades.
3 decades.
Yeah.
Wow. Until recently, I think you were a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder until 2024. And I think you describe yourself on your Substack as a recovering academic. And you're now a fellow at the conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, and you write a lot on Substack under the Honest Broker brand, which I'm a big fan of. I think I may even be a paying subscriber, so I'm glad to contribute to your upkeep. Anyway, welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be with you.
So we have to have a bad idea for each episode to kick us off and to get into a conversation. And you've, stuck a toe into some pretty controversial waters over the last, 30 years, as we just discussed. So we've kicked around what could be the bad idea that you're tackling. And I think we landed on the bad idea is increasing disaster costs show extreme weather is getting worse. So to try and get into some of, the real nub of your climate work, which has been looking at how people tend to get it wrong when they talk about extreme weather and linking it to climate change. So can you kind of just give us a bit of a summary on that issue?
Yeah. First, great to be with you. Great to see you. A long time ago, in the mid-1990s, I had the chance to start a postdoctoral assignment at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And the project I was put on was extreme weather and its impacts. And this was before climate change was really a thing and a big deal. I had a friend, Chris Lancy, who was doing a postdoc up the road at Colorado State University. We used to play basketball together. And
he was a Hurricanes guy, wasn't he? I met him.
He's a Hurricane guy, yeah. I expect pretty soon he'll be the head of the National Hurricane Center. But at the time, he had just published a paper that showed that the period 1991 to 1994 was the least active 4-year period for North Atlantic hurricanes since 1950. And I was doing research on the economic impacts of hurricanes, and that exact same period was the most expensive period. And we talked about it. It's the least active, but the most expensive. And so that led us to doing some research to look at what the costs of historical hurricanes would be with contemporary levels of property development population. And what we found, and really have worked on since, is that the overwhelmingly most important factor in the costs of disasters, which are significant and increasing, is what we build, where we build it, and how many of us there are. The changes in extreme weather, the variability, that's important, but it's a much smaller influence. And so over the years, as climate change has become really a public topic, and it's an important topic because climate change is real and it's having impacts, people have come to use impacts, notably economic impacts of disasters, as a proxy for identifying changes in climate. And that's a problem because number one, it distracts from the real reasons behind why we see economic impacts. But it also distracts from the fact if you want to identify signals of climate change, look at climate data, not economic data. And so this is a confounding issue. And then I guess I'll put a third layer on there. If you say this sort of thing, as I have, and I've been saying it since before climate change was a thing, people think you're minimizing climate change because you're identifying economic factors as the real key behind increasing disaster losses. So it's a really confounding issue, but it's one where I think we should get the science right, regardless.
Yeah, so let's get the science right in a sort of general sense at the moment. Are hurricanes affected by climate change in any identifiable way? Never mind the economic stuff, but I mean, do you see climate data which convinces you that hurricanes are getting, stronger or more frequent or anything like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's the right way to approach this is by specific phenomena. The general big bucket extreme weather isn't particularly useful. Climate change is real and it affects all weather. There's no way around it. The humans have affected the climate system. If you take a look at how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change looks to identify signals of climate change, the first thing they do is they engage in what's called detection. And they say, have we seen a trend in the climate variable? It could be number of hurricanes, could be the intensity of hurricanes, how much rain falls from hurricanes, where they make landfall. You can pick your favorite variable. And they say, have we seen a trend in that variable over climate timescales? And the canonical climate timescale is 30 years, but it's a long time. So climate timescales you should think of as kind of like a human lifespan. It's not what happens this week to next week or this year to next year. And the IPCC has been very consistent since 1989 when it was formed, that the signal of changes in what are called tropical cyclones, hurricanes are a subset of that, has not been detected with high confidence anywhere on the planet. There are some hypotheses that perhaps we will have fewer hurricanes in the future and a larger proportion of them will be intense hurricanes. There's also a hypothesis that hurricanes are getting wetter, meaning that there's more rainfall falling from them. But if you look at the projections of the IPCC, they don't expect to detect those changes with high confidence before 2100. So for me, if people can believe whatever they want to believe about hurricanes, understand what the IPCC says, but also understand that if you want to mitigate the impacts of hurricanes, we don't need to know with precision what climate is doing. We need to know that the largest factor behind damage and other human impacts, is what we build, where we build, how we build it, and the policies and procedures we put in place for dealing with these extreme events, which existed long before people did and will continue to have significant impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably too many people think that hurricanes are somehow a creation of global warming, and they've become the kind of canonical symbol of it. Remember, the Inconvenient Truth movie had that tropical cyclone sort of spiraling out of the top of this smokestack chimney, even though it was spinning the wrong way, certainly for a Northern Hemisphere cyclone, which bugged me. Because I went storm chasing in 2002 off the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Hurricane Gustav as it was, and I was doing that for my book High Tide, looking at the impacts of climate change. And I remember speaking to scientists at the National Hurricane Center in Florida and elsewhere, and they all said, there's no clear signal in the data yet, and this was in 2002, that climate change has impacted hurricanes in any measurable way. I think I would have been surprised back then to be still sat here in 2025 and still no signal's been detected in the data. So let's just really emphasize that. Are you just quoting the IPCC? Is that your opinion, or what's the most kind of the scientific consensus on this?
Yeah, so that is the scientific consensus still, and the reason for that, it's not unexpected. If you want to look for signals of changes in climate, extreme weather is probably one of the worst places to look. So from 2002 until today, the most notable feature of the climate record for hurricanes in the continental United States was the period 2006 to 2017 when there was not a single major hurricane. A major hurricane is a category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane that hit the U.S. It's almost like Al Gore's movie caused hurricanes to be scared away from the coast for a while. But it also, I mean, if you think about it, if you are interested in climate change, you're a scholar or you're an activist, and you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, a defining feature of your lived experience is this decade plus long stretch with no extreme hurricanes hitting the U.S., which is unprecedented in the historical record. And so it's quite accurate to say, well, when I think back 20 years, we didn't used to have extreme hurricanes, and today we do. And that would be an accurate statement, and which is why it's important to understand that it's very difficult for you or I, with our short lifespans and our ability to be in one place at one time, to actually experience climate change. It's very easy to say, well, we didn't have hurricanes and now we do, and say, well, that must be due to climate change. That's why we do science. It's really important. But at the same time, if you go back to 1900 and you say, all right, how many hurricanes have made landfall in the continental United States? It's 200 and some hurricanes. It's not a large number. If I were just to take a deck of cards and insert 2 aces, I'm stacking the deck. So there's been deck change. And then we were going to play blackjack or poker or something. You would have to play a lot of hands before you could detect that there was a change. Because even though you're adding 2 aces to the deck, it's a subtle change. So think about changes in climate similarly. The changes are not expected to be really large in comparison to natural variability, which is why the IPCC doesn't expect detection of hurricane, for example, changes to occur this century. It's not because there's not changes, it's because the changes that they do expect are small in comparison to variability. And a lot of the discussion, we can talk about this, the media hype, gets people to think, well, the changes must be massive, right? I'll be able to see them next year, over the next decade. And that's just not where the science is right now. And that's a good thing, because if there were changes detectable in that time frame, it would be far outside what the scientific community, scientific consensus expects right now.
Is there even a consensus about what the dimensions of change would be expected to be for tropical cyclones? I mean, let's say for a really extreme climate scenario where we get 3 or 4 plus degrees of warming, what would happen to tropical cyclones in that world?
Yeah, so there's literally hundreds of modeling studies. And I tell people, you tell me what outcome you want in the future, I'll find you a study to support that. But the general consensus, and this is where it gets a little tricky, because science is not a democracy. You don't vote with studies. But there was a review paper that Tom Knudsen led for the World Meteorological Organization, where they summarized the literature available at that time. And the kind of the fat part of the bell curve is an expectation that the strongest tropical cyclones might get a little bit stronger, single-digit percentage stronger. There might be fewer overall tropical cyclones, so fewer storms of hurricane strength. Of those fewer storms, a greater proportion might be extreme storms. That gets confused in public discourse. When people say a greater proportion, people think that means more storms, and that's not necessarily the case. If you have fewer hurricanes and a greater proportion, it might just be the same number. All of this is highly, highly uncertain. So that's the fat part of the bell curve, but the bell curve has some pretty long tails on either side. It is an area where there is a lot of uncertainty. If you go from scientists like Kerry Emanuel, who's very bullish on climate's effect on hurricanes, to Tom Knudsen, to Chris Lancy, to others, you can get a lot of different opinions. And this is one of those areas where if you say scientific consensus, the scientific consensus in this particular area is wide and flat. It's not like temperature change. With temperature change, it's narrow and tall. There's a pretty strong consensus on the effects of greenhouse gases on temperatures. For hurricanes, there's much more diversity of opinion, and that's okay. That doesn't limit us from responding to climate change, either energy policy or adaptation. What it does, though, is it sets up a situation where it's very easy for people to make claims that are very strong but very much out of step with this broad perspective of the expert community.
But if the expert community believes, as you're asserting, that hurricanes are not identifiably getting impacted by climate change, how come you pointing this out gets you cancelled?
Yeah, well, the first thing is I can't be canceled. That's one thing I've learned. So I mean, it really goes back to you mentioned it, Al Gore's movie with the hurricane coming out of the smokestack. At that time, Hurricane Katrina had just had devastating impacts to New Orleans. More than 1,000 people died. It was a horrific event compounded by horrific policy failures by the Bush administration. For better or worse, hurricanes have become kind of the poster child, literally, of the climate movement. They're very photogenic. They come around every year. They're reliable, and they make for a talking point. At some point, and I lived through this in the 2000s. The climate activist community decided it's not enough to tell people that temperatures are going to increase by single-digit degrees by 2100. People have to take the kids to school. They got to pay the bills. That's not going to move the dial for climate activism. And in the United States, in particular, there was this idea that we bring climate home to people through the lens of extreme events, through extreme weather. And we convince people that the extreme weather that they see on TV, that maybe they've experienced in their community, that was caused by the proverbial smokestack. For me, at the time, I tell a story that in 2006, I won an award from the National Academy of Sciences, the Roger Pielke Award, for my work on extreme weather and the role of population change. That was 2 months before Al Gore's movie came out. For me, everything changed at that moment because doing research that showed that the impacts of extreme weather are due to us making decisions about where we live and how much wealth we put in harm's way. If you live, by the ocean or in the floodplain, you're going to experience disasters. If that's the way it is. But that was a very inconvenient message for those who are saying extreme weather is the result of climate change, and the impacts that you see on your TV and now your social media feed are due to greenhouse gases. So it was a very weird experience for me, finding my research go from being celebrated to being criticized for being inconvenient. And I mean, to be honest, in the academic community, if you look at Google Scholar and so on, my research does this just fine. You would not be able to say, oh, this guy's the subject of attacks from environmentalists by looking at my academic record. It is more a social media phenomenon and more a political phenomenon that I've took a while to understand and come to grips with. But there is a broad understanding in the research community of what drives the costs and impacts of disasters. Even if it's not popular and not too many people stick their necks out, it's not particularly controversial. And part of the reason is not rocket science either. It's pretty obvious. If you have two big hotels on a beach and they get flattened, you can have twice as much damage as if you have one hotel. I mean, it's that simple.
Well, zero hotels if the same storm was hitting in 1901. I mean, these places were undeveloped. So, and that's even taking account of inflation. So you've done this work, which is normalizing. Is that what it's called?
Yeah. So Chris Lance and I, after we were on the basketball court, we decided to write a paper where we wanted to adjust the historical costs of hurricanes hitting the continental United States for more property, more people, and we called that normalizing. We invented a word. And actually it kind of took off. There's probably 70 or 80 studies now normalizing the impacts of extreme weather events all around the world. Floods in China, landslides in Switzerland. I mean, there's a lot. And the idea there is simply to come up with a methodology to adjust. And there's many different approaches to normalizing. These studies are very popular in insurance and reinsurance because they use models to assess what risk exists, and this is a independent methodology to kind of verify or evaluate their models. And I mean, for example, we find in our research, and I can, this is some breaking news, where Jessica Wankel, a former student of mine, who I've collaborated with for a long time, we are updating the normalized U.S. hurricane record. And the 1926 Great Miami Hurricane is, in 2025 terms, approaching $400 billion of losses. That is maybe 4 times the cost of Katrina. So things could be much, much worse. And it's really hard for us to get our mind around the fact that not only does climate change, but society changes. And society changes at a much faster rate than the climate does. Swiss reinsurance estimates that overall, over the planet, insured losses from extreme weather events are increasing at 7% per year. That's not because extreme weather is getting 7% worse per year. They identify the largest signal to be exposure. So that's again, what we build and where we build it and how we protect it. So trying to put that in context is really important. It's just that the climate debate kind of stuck its nose into this issue and became very political.
Yeah, I mean, you'd expect the insurance industry to take an interest. And I remember there was a time when all the climate folks I was working with were, hoping that the insurance industry would be the ones to tell the fossil fuel industry to stop because it was going to cost them and they were going out of business. But that seems not to have happened, at least to anything like the extent that was expected. But all right, so hurricanes are out. What about the other so-called climate disasters? What other extreme weather phenomenon are or are not related to climate impacts?
Yeah. So one thing to understand, and it's really important, is that for any phenomena, I can find an expert or even a research paper to support a claim that this particular event is getting worse or more intense. What we need to do collectively is not to cherry pick this or that expert or this or that study, but we need to assess the science broadly. And then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, I often say if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. There are hundreds of thousands, literally millions of peer-reviewed papers published on aspects of climate every year. And understanding what that sprawling literature says is a huge task. And so for extreme events, the IPCC's Working Group 1, which focuses on physical sciences, has over its 30 years of existence, summarize the literature on extreme events. And I often point to that. My research is cited in there. Others is cited in there. And from my perspective, their research is consistent with the consensus, again, which could be wide or could be narrow in the community. And so I often just simply point to the IPCC as the best available snapshot of where the science is. So with that long introduction, we can go phenomena by phenomena. Where there's the most certainty among the expert community in changes in climate that are the result of greenhouse gases is heat. So extreme temperatures. Heat waves have increased, not everywhere, but in many places around the world. And the IPCC has identified those increases as being due to accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The next most certain conclusion of the IPCC is that extreme precipitation has increased. Here we have to be careful because extreme precipitation is kind of like an ink blot. If I say it to a normal person, they'll think heavy downpours, they'll think floods. The scientific community is very precise when they talk about extreme precipitation. Sometimes they mean it's precipitation at 95% threshold for a particular location. Here in Colorado, that's not a particularly high threshold. We don't get a lot of rain here. Extreme precipitation is not the same as flooding. And the IPCC in their last report was very good about making that clear. but the IPCC is fairly strong that extreme precipitation has increased in some locations around the world. After that, things get pretty uncertain, whether it's floods, tropical cyclones, tornadoes, drought. And drought is another concept where the IPCC uses 4 definitions of drought. And the IPCC says, well, soil moisture deficits, if we use that as a measure of drought, they have increased. And they hypothesize that they are due to the increasing heat. But if you look at hydrological drought, so which is, let's say, streamflow, or meteorological drought, which is rainfall, there's much less certainty worldwide. Once you start going down the list of different extreme events, you find that a lot of the headlines, the things that we see on TV, the big flooding in Germany, the tornado that goes through the U.S. Midwest, the typhoon that makes landfall in Bangladesh, there's not much certainty at all that there have been detectable changes in those phenomena, much less attributing any changes to human-caused climate change. Again, the reason for this is if you want to look for the signal of climate change, it helps to have a lot of data. And this is why temperature, which is measured everywhere on the planet, every moment for a long time, and precipitation, which happens or doesn't happen everywhere on the planet every moment, are the best places to look for signals of climate change. You have dozens of extreme events, maybe hundreds, depending on how you define them, every year. It's not like the millions and millions of data points we have for temperature and precipitation. The IPCC has been very consistent over time. And one of the notable things I've observed is that in the media, in particular, the mainstream media, there's much less referencing of the IPCC on extreme events. They tend to go to...
They don't say anything interesting, that's why. I mean,
they tend to go to people who make stronger claims. And
right.
So, I mean, it is, I give full props to the IPCC for playing things straight for 30 years on this topic, even though it's not particularly popular and not widely appreciated. The IPCC doesn't trumpet these conclusions for sure, but they're there. And if anyone wants to, look, go to Chapter 12 of Working Group 1, Table 12.12, and it's summarized pretty well there.
You've obviously cited this before. I mean, I've lost count of the number of headlines I've seen saying, X floods in Pakistan are 50 times more likely or 5 times more likely or whatever it was. And that's then referenced back to an attribution study. So the way that they get over the lack of data, as you just said, there's lots of data for precipitation and temperature, but not much on extreme events because by definition they're infrequent. So your signal to noise ratio isn't there, is to run it through a climate model and then run the climate model 100,000 times, and there's your lots of data, and that's how attribution studies work, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say there has been this. We live in an era of alternative facts, and there has been this development of a counter narrative to the IPCC, and it's one group in particular, World Weather Attribution. They say that their goal is to get in the media in the days after an event. And support lawsuits against fossil fuel companies, and they bypass the peer review process. They put out press releases, and what they do is, I've critiqued their methodology, but they come up with a pretty straightforward, simple method to identify the asserted influence of human-caused climate change on extreme weather. And as you say, they say, well, this event was 40 times more likely, 7 times more likely because of climate change. That they're in a difficult spot because if something is 40 times more likely, then over the last 50 years, there should be a trend there. And if you don't see a trend, as the IPCC concludes, then somebody is not correct. So, but it has been very influential in the media in particular. I don't think it's been particularly influential in the scientific community, or for that matter, in broad-based public opinion. But it does occupy a lot of attention.
I mean, I don't think they'd characterize themselves as a counter narrative to the IPCC. I think they see themselves, I'd have to get someone on to talk about it, but, it's amazing really how sort of politicized this issue has become. I mean, I said you were cancelled. I mean, you think you even refer to yourself as he who must not be named in climate science. There's a big picture of
Right.
Voldemort on your page. You're
Right.
even on Dismog's climate disinformation database. What have you done to get this kind of a name for yourself? Surely not just pointing out accuracies in science. Maybe you're too one-sided or something.
Yeah, others can decide what that is. I've been doing this for a long time. I was an early and probably one of the more successful bloggers, if people know what a blog is, from 20 years ago, in the climate space. I got in trouble for a lot of reasons. I don't think it's just the extreme weather stuff. I mean, early on when there was the controversy over Michael Mann's hockey stick, I tried to broker a detente between Steve McIntyre, Mann's arch enemy, and Michael Mann, and offered to help them write a paper together to identify areas of agreement and disagreement. Did
that end well?
No. So McIntyre said he would be happy to participate. Michael Mann said he would never work with the devil. The climate debate from very on evolved in a way that was very morality and Manichaean based, that there's good people and there's bad people. Pick a side. And if you're not on the good people,
and the bad people are all funded by the oil industry, right? Yourself included.
Yeah. And that's another story too.
Just to be clear, but we'll get into that, because I think you were hounded by politicians, weren't you?
I was investigated by Congress, accused of taking money from ExxonMobil. But yeah, I mean, this as well too. I mean, it really leapt, into the stratosphere with Bjorn Lomborg's book in 2001, Skeptical Environmentalist. And the climate community organized. Steve Schneider, the late Steve Schneider, who I knew fairly well from my time at NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research, organized a campaign to get Cambridge University Press to cancel his book. Fortunately, Cambridge didn't do that, and the world survived Lomborg's book. But there was
I played my part. I threw a pie in his face. So.
I know. Yeah. So, I mean, you know this very well, that there was this idea that you're on the side of virtue or you're on the side of evil. And that came to define the climate issue and issues of nuance. And unfortunately, what I would call scientific integrity, just calling things as they are and letting the chips fall where they may, rather than creating messages to support narratives, has kind of taken root. I mean, I can tell you, after George Bush was elected, the National Academy of Sciences organized a one-day workshop. It had like 5 or 7 experts. I was one of them that was invited. Before I went, and it was with the Secretary of Treasury, it was with a couple senators, Democrats and Republicans. And the idea was to help the Bush administration to appreciate and understand where climate science was at the time, which is very similar to where it is today. And I was invited. And before I went, I got an email from a very prominent leading climate scientist. And this was one of the things that's kind of one of those career-defining moments. He said to me, and I'll just paraphrase. He said, "You do really good research. It's I agree with it. It's accurate, related to societal effects of extreme weather. But you have to be careful going into a political setting that your research might be misused by the people who are opposed to climate action. And so maybe you should downplay or not even share your conclusions and emphasize the importance of mitigating greenhouse gases." And for me, I got the sense, I don't know if this was the intent, but the sense that I was being asked to misrepresent my research for political purposes. And I decided not to do that. And so, really, since, for the last 20 years, I've lived my professional life out in public. All my research and, my approach to research and my good ideas, my bad ideas, I put out in public. And some of them aren't popular. And it's fine. I'm not in a popularity contest. I can tell you, I also do research on transgender athletes.
I was going to say, you're not happy enough being cancelled by the climate community. You go and study the trans issue in sports. I mean, come on.
Right. But the interesting thing is that the people who criticize me for my climate research love my work on trans athletes, because I'm an advocate for regulated inclusion, and vice versa. And so, and that's okay. I mean, researchers shouldn't evaluate their success by whose politics are benefiting from your research. That's not how it works. So it's, so I've been in the climate space, and, at some point, maybe, if I had a time machine, I'd revisit this decision. But at some point I decided, I'm going to focus my career on controversial science and highly politicized contexts. And, it's important.
And so tell us the story about how you got hauled up in front of Congress and accused of taking money from the fossil fuels industry.
Yeah. So in 2013, and I occasionally give testimony before the U.S. Congress. Originally, I was always invited by Democrats, and then eventually I got invited by Republicans. Interestingly, I say pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
But in 2013, I testified. I don't remember maybe it was the House Science Committee and then the Senate Energy and Commerce Committee. Same testimony before the House and Senate. And I think it was my Senate testimony. So when you give testimony before the U.S. Congress, you start with basically a 5-minute presentation, and you're limited. There's a little buzzer that goes off. So my 5 minutes, it went viral on YouTube. I don't know why. It had 400,000 views in the weeks after my testimony. Brought a lot of attention. What did I testify about? I summarized the conclusions of the IPCC special report on extreme events. This was a report that came out in 2012, and said basically what we've been talking about, that societal factors are the most important in damages. We don't detect changes in most metrics of extreme weather events. So I summarized it. It went viral. Brought a lot of attention to me and my work. Just a couple months later, President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, testified before the same Senate committee. And he got, as we say in Colorado, he got a little forward on his skis in some of the claims he made. And one of the senators called him out on it. And unfortunately, that senator name-checked me. And so, we had Professor Pielke here a couple months ago summarizing the IPCC, and he said things that were contrary to what you're telling us. It was embarrassing for Holdren. I get it. He went back to the White House, and he published on the White House website a 6-page, I'm going to call it a screed. It's kind of the sort of thing your crazy uncle might put on Facebook, just basically ranting and raving about me. And I realized, the White House is truly a bully pulpit, emphasis on bully. That brought a lot of attention to me. And soon after, a member of Congress, Raul Grijalva, from New Mexico, who recently passed away, he wrote a letter to the president of my university and also several other academics. And he said, "We have reason to believe that Professor Pielke may be taking money from ExxonMobil in exchange for his testimony to Congress, because his views are contrary to President Obama's science advisor." That letter and the subsequent investigation by my university really turned my life upside down and changed the course of my career. I've had oral surgery, and I'd much prefer oral surgery to that sort of thing. But there's a few details that matter. Like, a few university presidents refused to investigate their faculty. They said no. They have academic freedom. My university.
This happened to several academics. It wasn't just you.
Right. It was, I think it was 7 in total. Judy Curry was another one. I think Steve Hayward was another. I don't remember all the people. I do know, I think Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State, said no. Up the road from Grijalva's district, said, no, we're not going to investigate. My university investigated. It was fine. Show all your financial records, show all your emails, show all the drafts of your testimony.
This was UC Boulder, was it?
Yeah. University of Colorado Boulder. I have never taken money from ExxonMobil or energy interests. And I said it so publicly at the time. And, I, being a very public figure, I was very public about how absurd this was. I called it a witch hunt. There was some support from the scientific community. The American Meteorological Society, to their credit, said Congress shouldn't be investigating. They shouldn't be investigating Michael Mann. They shouldn't be investigating Roger Pielke. I was a defender of Michael Mann when he was being investigated by Congress, a decade before. And so, but that basically, and I think it's fair to say, for a year or two, I was pretty much canceled. Like all my speaking invitations were rescinded. I was not asked to co-author papers with colleagues, and that's what led me to working on sports for about 4 or 5 years, which I continue to do. Which was that's how I got into working on transgender athletes, because there's plenty of controversies involving science in a lot of areas. But that was one where I realized that the climate issue had gotten to the point where, and I was less concerned about a politician politicizing climate issues than I was with my colleagues. There continue to be, and I think they're much less impactful in the community than they were. But there were what the journalist Keith Clore called the science police. There were people who really wanted to police discourse in support of a preferred narrative that was in support of preferred politics. There's less of that now. It's still prevalent in many areas. I think of the origins of COVID, for example, which is another highly politicized issue. But for me, that was that was one of the points in my career that definitely marked a significant turn.
But haven't you just confirmed how evil you are, though, by going off to work for the American Enterprise Institute? I mean, that's a right-wing think tank. Presumably they take money from the fossil fuels industry. So maybe these Democrat witch hunters were right all along.
Yeah, so the American Enterprise Institute, which I affiliated with in 2024, and then after I announced I was retiring from the University of Colorado, they asked me to join the staff there. It's a fantastic place to work. The U.S. has a very strong think tank culture. And to understand think tanks, some of them are advocacy think tanks. Like they take a position, and everyone that signs on kind of supports that position. American Enterprise Institute, AEI, historically is center right. They sit in DuPont Circle in Washington, right next to the Brookings Institute, which is center left. Right now, the U.S. pretty much has 4 distinct political poles. You've got the MAGA Republicans, you got center right, you got center left, and you got the progressive Democrats. AEI has historically been center right, and they are extremely strong in stating that even though historically they're identified as being on the center right, their scholars have complete academic freedom, and so there are people at AEI who are, I would say, quite liberal in the American sense, kind of on the left. There's a few people who are MAGA, a lot of people in the center right, a lot of people in the center left. It's a very diverse place. No one at AEI in the time that I've been affiliated with them asked me who I vote for, asked me what my party registration is, asked me what my politics are. The president of AEI, Robert Dorr, who I think is a great leader, he tells me all the time, he says, keep doing what you're doing. Because whatever it is, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. So the other thing I've come to appreciate, AEI's funding, and I think this is just about right, 70% comes from individual donors. And a much smaller proportion comes from corporations and foundations. AEI has not historically been funded by the energy or fossil fuel industry because they haven't had expertise in climate or energy. There was a time, and I think it was like 10 or 15 years ago, they kind of flirted with some folks who were more in what we would call the climate denial camp. There's none of that now. And they'd have a nice firewall between the scholars and the fundraising. So I'd be hard pressed to name, where their funding comes from, and I don't care. If they support me to do my work and tell me to do what I do, I think that's great. I'm having a debate with Ben Zeiker, another AEI scholar, in September on the EPA endangerment finding. He thinks it should go away, and I think it should stay. And we're both AEI scholars, and the institution is organizing a debate around that topic. The last thing I'll say is I have experienced more confidence in academic freedom in the year plus I've been affiliated with AEI than I felt at my university for the 10 or 15 years prior. So the last thing that anyone should do is evaluate anyone's arguments based on who they're affiliated with. It matters, of course. If I was taking money under the table from ExxonMobil, that would be important to disclose. I'm not. But at the same time, if you're in the business of ideas and argument, at some level, we should engage ideas and argument on their own merits, recognizing that there will be affiliations and there is money in politics. But reality also matters, and it can't be just boiled down to interests.
Yeah, and I'm playing devil's advocate to an extent here because actually I don't think there's anything wrong with having conservatives doing climate science. Like, I would actually prefer to have a world where science was more politically diverse because I think that would help us not to get into the situation where you've got this incredible partisanship now and culture wars in science. And as you say, not just climate science, but COVID and other issues too. So something has happened though, hasn't it? Because the surveys of academia show that there's been this trend towards like incredible levels of liberalism and progressivism in the last, few decades, I think. I mean, so it's now vanishingly unlikely to find a Republican doing, I don't know, even climate research. And I think that's a problem. I mean, do you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, and I've written on this for a long time. And it's been a long time coming. I am, on record being strongly opposed to what the Trump administration is doing to institutions of science and academia. But I think we have to understand that this is not an overnight issue, and both sides of the political spectrum played a role. If you look back, I mean, we mentioned the debate over Bjorn Lomborg in the early 2000s, but it wasn't long after that with the re-election of George W. Bush, the scientific community in the United States organized itself to be in opposition to, at the time, Republicans. There was quite a prominent book at the time called The Republican War on Science, and Democrats and Republicans both liked that framing. In the United States, it happens everywhere, but we have what we call wedge issues. These are issues that politicians can bring to the public to divide them. Transgender athletes is another one. They're very simple. They're very black and white, good and bad. And science was readily available, partly because the academy and scientific institutions had leaned more to the left, but had also become more overtly political in their work. I remember before the 2004 election, I think it was the first time ever something like 47 Nobel Prize winners signed on a letter endorsing John Kerry. It's very easy for people on the left to rally around that. And it's also very easy for people on the right to say, oh, look, there are a bunch of liberals in the scientific establishment. When Barack Obama ran, one of his taglines was, we're going to restore science to its proper place. And its proper place was the bosom of the Democratic Party. When the Trump administration first came in 2016, they identified scientists as people who were opposed to MAGA, and that was not wrong. J.D. Vance, the current U.S. vice president, gave a speech a couple of years ago where he said the universities are the enemy. And so this has been a long time coming. Climate science has been kind of the tip of the spear. It's been very politicized for very long. A leading spokesperson, a celebrated spokesperson for the climate movement is Michael Mann, University of Pennsylvania. Just a few weeks ago, he put out on, I think it was on Blue Sky or X or Twitter, a statement that it's time to invoke the Second Amendment against Donald Trump. The Second Amendment is, in the United States, the right to bear arms. That was not a very subtle threat against the president of the United States. Whatever you think about Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whatever, the more political, overtly political the scientific community is in one direction, the more it puts a target on itself for being subject to political attack. I tell people in the United States, there's something like 5 million PhDs total. In a voting population of like 180 million. There are something like 70 million people who have terminal high school degrees, so no college. If we in the PhD class think we're going to be a political movement, or that people are going to care that we're credentialed, we're going to get destroyed in democratic populist politics. And so, set aside who's right, who's wrong about the merits of the issue as a matter of just pure power politics. Experts need a broad base of political support. And that means Republicans, and that means Democrats, and that means progressives, and that means MAGA. And we ignore that reality at our own peril, because if we go pick a fight, we're going to probably lose.
Well, you have picked a fight and you are losing. I mean, every single institution of American scientific probity is being defunded aggressively by the Trump administration, from the National Science Foundation to NOAA to, obviously what's going on with Harvard is another issue as well. I mean, so it seems to, what can we do, and what sort of sides do you take on what's currently happening?
Yeah, I think it's horrific. I think the MAGA Trump folks are taking a wrecking ball to institutions of expertise and institutions of science and academia. I do think Harvard is part of all of this. The MAGA movement is right now focused on, quote unquote, owning the libs, which in U.S. speak means they just want to cause destruction and harm to their political enemies. We in the expert community need to begin this, and it's going to be difficult, this long process of rebuilding broad-based public support for what we do. I don't know what can be done, in the days and weeks ahead. Go to the courts, fight the Trump administration. But if we take the bait and we say, well, we're the party of the extreme left and we're going to fight the party of the extreme right, I think that's a mistake. One thing to recognize in the United States is, if you just pay attention to the media, there's a lot of focus on Donald Trump and opposition to Donald Trump. Most normal Americans are not in either of those camps. They're living their lives, they're working, they're paying the bills. So I do think that we experts need to reestablish kind of the fact that we're in a social contract. The public provides support for the work that we do, whether it's academic freedom, whether it's federal financing of grants and contracts to do research. And the expectation is that everybody benefits from the work that scientists and universities do. That social contract has truly broken down. And if you look at public opinion, confidence in science and confidence in the medical establishment, confidence in university has taken a dip. And it's pronounced among MAGA Republicans, but it's also across the board. It's among Democrats. It's among the only group that has not seen such a dip in confidence in expertise are liberal, wealthy, well-educated Democrats, people who are just like the scientific community. Pretty much everyone else, whether they're Hispanics or Blacks or high school graduates, has seen a loss of confidence. And we need to work to restore that confidence. And we're not going to restore it by being the resistance.
I mean, I'm trying to figure out why this happened. Obviously, it's a multi-decadal trend, this sort of political polarization within science. Was it COVID? Did something big happen because of the COVID pandemic, which somehow really spiraled this? And if so, what was it?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the fuel, the gasoline was available and the fire was already burning, and COVID kind of combined the two. The COVID mandates, again, the United States stands apart from most countries around the world in that there was no centralized expert advisory body on COVID. In the UK, you had the SAGE, and most countries had some high level body, and we can critique, what they did, how they did it, but they existed, and they provided a kind of a point of departure for discussion and debate of COVID science. In the U.S., the Trump administration had what was called the COVID task force, and it was a group of, as the Trump administration does, a group of political appointees. So in the U.S. system of government, you have what are called career officials. These are government officials in the bureaucracy that are there from president to president, and they often have very specialized expertise, whether it's intelligence or health or whatever. And then above them, you have what are political appointees. Each president can appoint their people to lead the bureaucracy. The Trump administration's quote unquote expert body for COVID was political appointees. They were his people. And it became very political very quickly. And in the US, you had what are called red states, Republican-led states, and blue states, Democrat-led states, that implemented very different sorts of policies for masking, distancing, school closures. And COVID, it was interesting because if you look prior to COVID, the side of the political spectrum that was the most skeptical about vaccination were Democrats.
Yeah, and
the more left you were, the more skeptical you were of vaccination. Well, COVID flipped that on its head, and now Democrats seem to love vaccination, and Republicans don't.
You can see this in the career of RFK Jr., can't you? I mean, he's was an icon of the left, and now he's MAGA through and through, leading the charge of destroying vaccines in the US.
Yeah, that's the personification of that trend. But I do think, and if you look at the public opinion polls, COVID was a big factor. But it's important to understand that the dynamics at play were decades in the making. There was, and I lived through it. There was this idea, in the UK, I think it was Mark Henderson wrote a book called the Geek Manifesto, and which was basically the idea that we in the expert class should create our own political party. We should lead a political party because we know more than other people. And I do think my community got a little bit heady in the political space, thinking that, we're the experts. We know how to respond to climate change. We know what to do on different topics, and people should respect our expertise. And the people that are opposed to us, well, they're know-nothings, they're anti-science. And again, people can point fingers, but we have to recognize. What I tell people is, I can't control what MAGA Republicans do, but what we in the expert academic community can do is control our own institutions. Nature, which is British-based, one of the leading science magazines, endorsed Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris in the last two presidential elections. Nature published a paper that showed in 2022 that the effect of their endorsement of Joe Biden in 2020 was to not change the mind of any people on the left. They were already going to do what they were going to do, but it made people on the right much more skeptical and opposed to science. That's what we would call an own goal. After that was published, Nature wrote an editorial that said, yes, we understand that research, but it's too important not to speak out. And so, these are self-inflicted harms to our community. No one cares what Nature thinks about the U.S. presidential election. No one cares what I think. No one cares what the PhD class thinks. And so, it's really important, I think, for the expert community to take a step back and understand we exist to support all of society. And childhood vaccination is important for Donald Trump's grandchildren as well as Joe Biden's grandchildren. It doesn't matter. And if we insist on taking sides in political debates, whatever side that happens to be, the other side is not going to appreciate us. It's really a simple political calculus. And so I really think we need to do a better job. And I do think there are some university presidents in the US that kind of get this now in ways they didn't before. We're speaking out and saying, yeah, we serve everyone, and we welcome everyone on our campus, no matter who they vote for. But it's going to take a while to restore trust in the institutions of expertise.
And what about the trans issue? I tend not to go there because, for obvious reasons. You have gone there. It's just, can science help on this? Because there are arguments that this won Trump the election. Perhaps more than anything else, this idea that, Kamala's for they, them, and Trump is for you. I think that was very potent. And so, so is science being abused in this area? And has your work helped? Can it help tell me what to think? Because as I say, I'm confused. I don't know what to say.
Well, I tell my students, I don't care what they think. I care how they think. Here's how I think about the issue. And my focus, and just to be perfectly clear, my focus is on the regulation of transgender athletes in elite sport competition. We've written a paper, I with Spencer Harris and several others, on high school kind of younger athletes. But my main focus is on elite athletes, like the Olympics and college sports in the U.S. And the important thing to understand is that sports organizations have no authority, no legitimacy to define anyone in terms of their sex or gender. That's not their role in society. Sports organizations are actually pretty simple. They organize competitions, and it's perfectly legitimate for sports organizations to decide who gets to compete in different competition classes, including men's and women's. That's their job. But the criteria, so when they encounter people in society, they already have a legal sex and a legal gender. And depending on your jurisdiction, it could be one, could be the other, could be under different words. What sports organizations do is they create competition categories to regulate fairness. So let's step outside gender and sex, which makes people go crazy. And let's talk about athletes who are amputees. So think Oscar Pistorius, who ran on the cheetah blades. And there's a competition called the Paralympics. And that, because you participate in the Paralympics, does not make you ineligible to compete in the Olympics. And so athletes who run on cheetah blades, and there's a number of them, have sought to have inclusion in the Olympics. And the jurisprudence around sport is that you can't just exclude someone because they're an amputee. That's not about, that's not legal in most settings, and it's not what sports about inclusion. So what the sports organizations say is, well, if your cheetah blades allow you to compete fairly, then you can be included. And so then it gets, well, who decides what's fair? And the sports courts have decided that, well, the organizations that oversee sport have to prove that cheetah blades are unfair. How do you prove that they're unfair? Well, this is where science and evidence comes in. So Oscar Pistorius, he was evaluated. Scientists argued on both sides, and the courts decided, well, we can't determine that he has an unfair advantage, and if we can't determine it, then he's going to run. So he participated. Before Tokyo, which was 2021, the Olympics, an athlete from Los Angeles named Blake Leeper, who also runs on cheetah blades, wanted to run, and he is fast on those cheetah blades. He runs faster than the existing world records for the distances he was running. And they evaluated him. The scientists argued, and the courts decided, yeah, he has an unfair advantage, and so he can't participate. So you have a case of inclusion, a case of exclusion. Both are determined by scientific arguments. So I bring this up for a transgender athlete who appears. The task of a sports organization isn't to determine, are you really a man? Are you really a woman? That's not their role. This is not. I mean, what's curious about this is it's become identity politics. It's not about your identity. It's about, do you have an unfair advantage? And so if the issue is boxing, let's say, or a judo or a combat sport, the criteria for unfair advantage are going to be very different than if it's archery or swimming or women's gymnastics. There is no trans athlete, trans woman who is ever going to be competitive in women's gymnastics. Why? Because women's gymnastics has developed over the years and has scoring rules that favor women's athleticism. And so it's so much so, and actually young girls, that they had to put age limits there, that the rules favor younger and younger girls who can do things that older women can't do. So what I have proposed is there's two important rules. One is, I call it a cap tie rule. For people who follow football, they'll know that if you're an international footballer and you play for a particular country at the elite level, you're tied to that country. So if Qatar wants to buy up all the Brazilian soccer players, it's really, really hard to do that, to change nationality. They're tied. You get a cap when you play an international match, so you're cap tied. If you're an elite athlete and you compete as a man or you compete as a woman, you're tied to that. You can't change to the other gender. People don't understand that it's really hard to be an elite athlete, whether you're a man or a woman. And all of the cases I am aware of controversies involving trans athletes involve athletes who were already elite wanting to change gender categories. It's very, you or I are not going to get up off the couch and say we're women and all of a sudden show up in the Olympics. It's not going to happen.
Definitely not, no.
So that's one rule. That takes care of pretty much 99% of the issues. Then when it comes to individuals who have transitioned and want to compete, the Australian system of sport does this very well. You evaluate the athlete on a case-by-case basis, just like you do with athletes who run on prostheses. And you ask, well, what does it mean to have an unfair advantage? If you're a rugby player, you could say, well, 100 kilos that's unsafe. That's unfair. Well, guess what? You have to apply that to athletes across the board, not just, based on their chromosomes. So I do think there are very straightforward ways, and it's messy because you will have some athletes who will be included, like Oscar Pistorius, and some athletes who are not, like Blake Leeper, and there will be judgment calls along the way. But it will be based on evidence of unfairness, not arguments about identity. The last thing I'll say on this is sport has been hijacked by campaigners, and it's particularly true in the UK, in the US also, but to a lesser degree, not in Australia for some reason or much any place else, as part of this broader culture war against trans individuals, because sport is popular and people see it. But it shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be the controversy that it has been, because it's sport is about inclusion and it's about fairness, and we have good procedures in place to figure those things out. So I will say that trans advocates don't like the cap tie rule, and people who are part of the gender warriors don't like any possibility of inclusion. This is like the climate issue, that there is forgive the phrase, but there is a third way here that's not as black and white as the political debate would have it.
Well, evidence-based fairness. I mean, you're speaking my language here, and it's been a fascinating conversation. I've got all these notes about other things I wanted to talk about. We're going to have you back on, because we haven't done planetary boundaries, we haven't done Pielke's iron law, we haven't done a number of things. So that, I'd love it if you could. But tell us before we wrap up, what are you going to do next? Because you're always picking these amazingly interesting things. So, like, what's your next controversy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm going to be focused a lot on restoring integrity to institutions of science, and the Trump moment. Hopefully, it's just a moment. The Trump moment will pass, and there will be a lot of wreckage to rebuild. And I want to focus a lot of attention on how the institutions of expertise can reclaim public support, public trust. And just, there is a crisis in certain areas of science where, honestly, bad science has taken root. AI makes this worse. And how do we make sure our own house is in order? I can't change big picture politics. No expert can, but we really can make sure that our own house is in order. And I'd like to focus, at more conversations on that. I don't think any one of us has the answers, but we do need to open up our communities for broader discussion of how we move forward.
Well, I look forward to hearing more about that, and wish you all the best. And in the meantime, would just like to say thank you, Roger Pielke Jr., for helping to save the world from bad ideas.
Mark, great to see you. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.